Thank you, Jay. Also like to thank Michael and Dumi Sani and Rebecca and Barron for great music today. That song that Michael sings gets me every time I hear it, and I've heard it now a good 45 or 50 times because we're introducing it in Renew today. And I don't know, by the time I get to that bridge, not for a minute was I forsaken. Whew! I want to stand up and shout. And I'm praying for y'all because I can tell that a lot of you are like, what's he talking about, stand up and shouting? But at any rate, it's good to see you this morning. Hey, everybody. Last week, we started a series on Elisha called God is Salvation. That's what Elisha's name means. God is my salvation. Last week, we revisited a great story of the Old Testament, how Elisha's mentor Elijah was caught up by a whirlwind with chariots of fire and fiery horsemen, leaving Elisha to carry on the work God called them to do. No doubt Elisha felt alone as he stretched out his mentor's mantle toward the Jordan River and shouted, "Where is the God of Elijah?" God proved that he was right there. Elisha performed many miracles right off the bat, validating his ministry to the company of the prophets and the rest of Israel and Judah. Before Elijah was transported to heaven, he asked Elisha what he could do for him. Elisha, in his realism and humility, asked if he could have what? All right, you guys, a double portion of Elijah's spirit. I don't know if such spirit can actually be measured, but miracles can be counted. Did you know that there are 5 miraculous events in the scripture directly associated with Elijah? Elijah directed them, humanly speaking. 6, if you count him being fed by ravens in the brook when he was running away from Queen Jezebel. For Elisha, there are 11 miracles that Elisha directly was involved in directing. And there was a 12th miracle that happened involving Elisha after Elisha died. Huh? It's a fascinating story, and maybe in one of the coming weeks, the remaining 2 messages, we'll touch on that. Stay tuned. Don't miss a Sunday. Invite your friends. There are differing opinions about the number of years Elisha spent being mentored by Elijah. I mentioned 20-ish years last week. A scholar I read this week said 8 years. I think a shorter time period actually makes more sense. But by the time we get here to 2 Kings chapter 4, Elisha has been the leading prophet of Israel for 1.5 to 2 years. Being a prophet in those days was a demanding and difficult job. No one who is doing wrong really enjoys being dressed down for their wrongdoing. Have you noticed that? And there were plenty of wrongdoers, from peasants to kings. Idolatry was rampant. Now with 2 Israeli nations, Israel and Judah, the people of Judah mostly kept to themselves and kept the temple to themselves too, while the nation of Israel went back and forth between 2 pagan religions. One of them, set up by King Jeroboam, masqueraded as God-ish worship, in which the people of Israel were invited to one of 2 convenient locations marked by huge golden calves, where they could offer sacrifices and pray. Do you remember when the children of Israel worshipped a golden calf in the wilderness? God was giving Moses the 10 Commandments, and he took so long up on Mount Sinai that the people pressured Aaron into building them an idol to worship. According to Aaron, the people threw in their gold into the bonfire, and out of the fire came a giant golden calf, walking and mooing. Right. Moses was furious. He ground up the golden calf and made his people drink it. Then God struck the people with a plague, because commandment number 1 says, "You shall have no other God before me, says the Holy One of Israel." If you remember this, you would think that Israel would have rejected any worship at the base of the statue of a golden calf, but they didn't seem to care. King Jeroboam and his own priests established their own festivals and religious practices. After the leaders watered down the truth and compromised some more, it wasn't difficult to accept the second pagan religion, the false religion of Baal, complete with human child sacrifice. How many of you know that when a society disintegrates, it's easy for the church to go with it? And how many of you know that when the church is compromised, she loses her ability to speak life into a culture? Yes. Just out of curiosity, does any of this sound familiar? It wasn't just Elisha's times. Unfortunately, these seem to be your times and my times too. The work of a prophet was difficult because they were constantly shouting against the false worship and immorality of their own countrymen, family members, and neighbors. Their lives were difficult as well because, as you can imagine, they weren't well received in most circles, and they were dependent upon the generosity of others. Generosity was hard to come by. In addition to the spiritual confusion and rebellion of the people, there is also quite an economic crisis, which you'll explore a little this week if you're following along with the devotionals and the Bible app events. Shameless plug. Or if you can't download the Bible app events, Marty, there are some handouts at the welcome desk with the devotionals for you. It says Soul Work Week 2. You can pick it up after the service is over. So this was a bad time to be a prophet, as if there was ever a good time to be a prophet. Our passage today with the widow and the oil is set in the midst of this time of religious unfaithfulness and economic chaos. First, we see the widow's predicament. Elisha was visiting one of the prophetic schools, probably Gilgal. I think this happened in a small town with little economic opportunity. I can see Elisha in Gilgal wrapping up his classes for the week. He's just finished a great series on how to dodge rocks thrown at you from every direction. There's a lot of logistics and choreography, and he hated the choreography. It's Thursday afternoon. He's been teaching since Sunday, and he's tired. After 10-hour days of instruction with the prophets, he counseled many of his students and people from the town, healed a few lepers. He had to attend a trustees meeting. It actually morphed into 3 meetings. And, well, that actually, he had to pass out awards at the Joshua Scouts banquet. And it was a long, long week. There was an aura of sadness over all the prophets and this school in particular. The untimely death of an esteemed senior prophet, Obadiah, hit them hard. Obadiah ministered in this town, in this company of prophets. Sadness and a sense of helplessness hung over the entire community. And though Elisha was a people person and sensitive to their emotional needs, he was looking forward to his modest but comfortable condo in Jericho. Elisha tucked his last scroll in his backpack and was picking up his mentor's famous mantle when he heard her crying out to him from across the town plaza. It was the voice of Obadiah's young widow, and she was clearly distraught. "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Obadiah was a good man, husband and father. He was a good preacher and fulfilled his prophetic duties with excellence and humility. Obadiah found a hiding place when Queen Jezebel launched a manhunt of all God's prophets. He found a hiding place for 100 of them. He hid them away until Jezebel's power was broken. There are a few problems now with hiding 100 prophets for an extended period of time. Feeding that many fugitives is one of the biggest ones. He had to borrow money to feed his friends. His widow was left with the debt, and his creditors were now threatening to take his sons away and force them to serve as slaves until the debt could be paid. This compelling story of Obadiah's heroism is handed down to us through Jewish tradition and is spoken of by great historians of that time period, but it is not in the Bible, so don't go looking for it this afternoon. Perhaps Obadiah, if that's his name, went into debt for less heroic reasons. The debt was still real, and the creditors coming after Obadiah's sons to enslave them was still real. And so was the desperation that the widow sensed. A large part of this story that is not told is the failure of the community to help. The community absolutely had a responsibility to the widow and orphan, and not only that, but they had a responsibility, I believe, to the company of the prophets. But the nation was in such disarray and unfaithfulness to God, so neglectful of their worship of him, and especially their responsibilities in that worship, that they allowed this obligation too to fall away. Regardless of the reason for the debt, the prophet still left behind him a legacy of faithfulness that the widow used as the basis of her appeal to Elisha. You know that he revered the Lord. I've spent a bit of time this week thinking about the plight of Obadiah's widow. I wonder, how many dads of daughters do we have here in the house today? You're a dad of a daughter. Raise your hand. All right. I have 2 young adult daughters. I want them to have happy and prosperous lives. Now, key to that happiness and prosperity, I believe, is who they will marry if they choose to marry. Before this woman in our scripture became a widow, she was a young single adult woman. A man named Obadiah started coming around and asking her out. Can you imagine this young woman's parents when she fondly told them that she was dating a prophet? A prophet. Not a doctor or a lawyer or even a shepherd. A prophet. And now, love would not only be all they needed, it would literally be all they had. And here she was, the widow of a penniless prophet. And not just a penniless prophet, but one who was heavily in debt. Yet of these 2 legacies, being wealthy or loving God, if you could choose only one of those for yourself, which legacy would you choose? And if you could choose only one of those for the future husband of your daughter, which one would you choose? Let's remember Jesus' words. No one can serve 2 masters. In fact, let's read it together. Ready? No one can serve 2 masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Obadiah loved God. He served the Lord. His widow, Elisha, and everyone else knew it. That's legacy. It was because of this that the widow could come to Elisha for help, and it was on the basis of this that Elisha directed a miracle on her behalf. But first, Elisha asks her a question. Well, asks her 2 questions. The first 5 words out of Elisha's mouth are so human. If you could ever relate to Elijah for feeling inadequate, you can really relate to Elisha for feeling just plain tired and wrung out when he asks, "How can I help you?" He may have actually said this under his breath, or maybe loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe he was ticked off at everybody else in the town. After all, it was the community's responsibility to look after a widow, and it was their responsibility to care for her fatherless children. It's very likely that everyone knew the situation she was in, yet help was non-existent. As Elisha said these words, his conscience may have spoken up, or maybe God simply took over, but Elisha stopped his human scarcity train of thought to ask a question that led to abundance for the widow and even for the community. What do you have in your house? And just like Elisha's pair of questions, the young widow gave a pair of answers. The widow said at first, I have nothing there at all. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by an enormous problem? Ever felt like you had no resources? Surely Elisha knew that she had nothing. Why was he even bothering to ask? But then maybe her conscience spoke up, or God took over, because the widow remembered she did have a little something, except a little oil. A millennium later, Jesus' disciples brought to Jesus a little boy whose mother planned ahead and packed for him a lunch of bread and sardines. Just 5 mini bread loaves and 2 small fish. It's all we could find, Master, they said. But what are these among 5,000? I have nothing here at all, the widow said through her tears. But then, except a little oil. So immediately Elisha says, go around to all your neighbors and ask for empty jars. These were the neighbors and church folk who could have been caring for her from the beginning. I think this shows us that God's design is that all of us bless one another. And as we do that, we share in each other's blessings. Secondly, we see in our instructions for abundance that we must ask for and gather many. We must exercise our faith. You may not see what God is doing now. Go ahead and click one more, 2 more. There you go. Awesome. Okay, now we're all caught up. Secondly, you must exercise your faith. You may not see what God is doing now, but you will. Go get a lot of jars. You may feel foolish going around and asking, but do it anyway. Trust the word and go in faith. Don't just gather a few, Elisha said. Get as many as you can, as big as you can. Now, for how many of us would this have been the end of the story? God, you know I can't do that. This is just too hard. I don't know my neighbors very well. What if they say no? This is just too much. Thank God the widow and her sons exercised their faith. Elisha told the widow to close her doors and do this where no one except she and her sons could see. We need to meet God in private to experience his abundance in public. More often than not, God prepares us in stillness and quiet and seclusion so that his glory may be displayed in the open with praise and wonder. How many of you believe that God wants every generation to know him? Amen, or hands up, okay. That was the group participation part of this message right there. Obadiah's sons needed to see the goodness of God in the wake of their father's death. Obadiah's sons needed to be the first to see this miracle, to sense for themselves something supernatural was going on, and to see their mom's joy as she took her tiny pitcher with just a little bit of oil clinging to the bottom, and with it filled up a small jar. And then another small jar. And then, hey boys, let's go over to this really big jar. Boys, I can't believe this is happening. Boys, God was good to your dad, and now see how good he is to us. All along the way, the widow had a part to play. She didn't just get to sit back and watch this play out. She was an active participant in the process. I think that's because of the kind of miracle this is. She had to be active. She couldn't rest on entitlement. She had to exercise her faith. The widow pours the oil into the jars, as many jars as she could find, this olive oil. Now, olive oil was used for many purposes, from common to extraordinary, from ointment to anointing, cooking, baking, and healing. And olive oil was valuable. And have you priced it at the grocery store lately? It's not cheap today either. Given the economic problems of the time and probably several years of famine, I'm sure that olive oil was a precious commodity, probably commanded top dollar. As I've reflected on this story, I believe that for us today, this oil represents the goodness and abundant provision of God. And I believe that the jars in this story represent facets of your life that need filling, areas of your heart that need filling, or maybe just all of you needs filling. Please note that God's provision equals the empty jars. I had these equations. I had to figure this out, and I put those slash marks directly over but oh well. New font changed, but you get the idea, right? God's provision equals the empty jars. God's provision is not greater than the empty jars in this situation. And in this situation, God's provision is not less than the empty jars. If the widow and her sons had gathered 50 jars, there wasn't enough oil for just 48. If they gathered 200 jars, there wasn't enough oil for just 199. The blessing and the provision of God was enough according to their faith. After this provision, the widow still had a role to play in order to activate her abundance. She still had to sell the oil. But even in the selling of the oil, there was a promise. There would be enough to pay her debts and enough for her and her boys to live on. As far as the widow was concerned, she was set for life. So I have a question for all of us this morning. What are we bringing to be filled by God? As Jay read for us in 2 Timothy 2, now in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honorable use, some for dishonorable. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work. In those days, running water meant that you ran to get water from a well or a spring. Once you quit running, you stored the water in jars or vessels, much like the vessels into which the widow poured the oil. Remember, the jars or vessels in these verses, just as in our story, represent facets of our lives that need filling, areas of our heart that need filling, or even ourselves. If pure oil is poured into a dirty jar, is the oil still pure? Probably not, right? If you pour oil into a jar that already has a bunch of stuff in the bottom of the jar, is that jar going to be completely filled with oil? Probably not. It doesn't matter what your vessels or jars look like on the outside. The widow and her sons had small jars and big jars. They had vessels with long, narrow necks and vessels with wide mouths and lids. They had big, round jars, and they had square jars. Some of the jars may have been chipped, or their paint may have been faded. God doesn't care what's outside, but on the inside of our vessels. What are we doing to prepare the jars we are bringing before God to fill? Have they been emptied and cleansed? Are we expecting God to fill them? There is one who came to us, fully God and fully man, to show us the way to the Father and a life of abundance. This one, Jesus Christ, emptied himself so that you could be full. He invites you to come be washed in his blood and cleansed from all impurity so that you can be filled with his goodness. Are you washed in his blood? Are you filled with his goodness today? God is still in the jar-filling business. Come to him with your empty jars, all that you want him to fill. Come on your own in private, but also come expecting this community to stand with you. You will have your part to play in God's abundance in your life. Come in faith, ready to do what he says to do, and believing that he will provide even for you. Come and realize the goodness and abundant provision of God. As we close, let's read this verse together. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. May God fill every jar we bring before him with his goodness, presence, love, and power. Amen. We'll continue with